It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's August the 23rd, 1981, and it's program number 507. For those of you who listen to this broadcast, I suggest again that if it goes fast for you, and I know it goes fast, a lot of names and events, send a self-addressed stamped envelope and 25 cents, and I'll send you a bibliography of the program. Last week I had about 40 important news items on the printed sheet that goes out with the tape cassettes, and many of you didn't get to hear those stories on the air, but the sources are on the printed sheet, and the same is true this evening. There's so many news stories flowing or gushing out that I can barely give you the title and the date and let you know that I'm classifying them, and then let you out on your own to the library to get books and information if the subjects interest you. I was in the car yesterday driving from a church in Carmel to a wedding reception here in Monterey, and on the NBC News there was a description of a ambush in El Salvador, and along the road they discovered, I think it was 74 headless bodies. I didn't see it in the news, the newspapers today, the Sunday papers. Maybe it'll be printed up later. I heard it on the NBC News. Earlier this week, I read a story about a circus group in El Salvador, and they had cut off the heads, decapitated 2 of the clowns and 5 of the employees of the circus. There was a time when I could read the news and just go through the various events, the assassinations, the murders, the napalming, and classify it and categorize it and finger who I thought was to blame for these atrocities, the accumulated guilt, and in some way I could control my anger. Very seldom do I really feel like crying when I read the paper, but it's getting bad, and it's getting bad because we weave in and out of events, and we hear these things, and then on comes another story, and on comes an event, and young couples getting married, not even aware, not reading the paper, families related to them, not knowing what the world around them is about, or not even asking the people that know what it's about, and people enveloping themselves in this world of not believing, which protects them temporarily, and then all of a sudden something happens, and they wake up and realize that the ostrich game, as I've mentioned before, just won't work or won't wash away. I was talking to Penn Jones this afternoon on the telephone. He's the long researcher into the Kennedy assassination who's published 4 books, and Penn was saying, America's falling apart at the seams and they're going to get us all. And I said, well, don't be so sure. What if we're the last 2 to survive and have to watch it from that point of view? Don't be so sure that when it comes fast, like in Nagasaki or Hiroshima, and that when a bomb falls on your head, you live to the fullest and then you go. There's a gray area there between full life and full death, and there's a lot of suffering, and the suffering is going on all over the world. And the purpose of the research, my research and others, is to try to stem the flow of the insanity. And the scene in El Salvador reminded me of the Ustashi and the Nazis, and of course they're Nazi-trained people and American forces and American money doing this decapitation down in El Salvador. And as long as people allow it, it will happen, and there are too many people allowing it, and it really makes me sick. This morning's newspaper, or this week's, Alexander Haig said, in quotes, I guess it was 2 days ago, the Libya incident is closed. I'm not going to discuss much about the plane fighting and the incident over there, except to say that it came just a few weeks, 2 weeks after headlines that the CIA was planning to kill Gaddafi. And Alexander Haig thinks he can have troops training right to the edge of the Libyan water and provoke them. And then he pulls back and says, that's closed, that's over, and we'll show you, we'll hit back again, we're strong. Well, Gaddafi didn't accept that, and of course in this morning's news, and all of you read it across the country, he said, we're ready to fight World War III. It's here, bring him on. And he blamed the United States. He says they have American fanaticism that will not end until there is another Vietnam. The United States armed Gaddafi. We trained the troops. We sent the assassination weapons. We've dealt with him constantly. And I believe we sent all those things over in advance so that when we killed him, we had the equipment in Libya to work with instead of being accused of sending it later. After we killed Allende in Chile, we began to send money back through the World Bank and major corporations to Pinochet in Chile, and then we could be accused of supporting a Nazi fascist dictator in Chile. So had they been smart, we would have sent more troops and guns and ammunition and Green Berets and killers to totally infiltrate the country, which is what I think we've done in Libya. And Mr. Gaddafi is turning against us. He'll meet us head on. This is what Adolf Hitler said. The United States corporations funded Adolf Hitler, and they funded Gaddafi. And I think that you have to respect the guy for saying we're convinced that Americans are fanatics, and this might be the occasion to start World War III. Now, this man isn't stupid. He's far from stupid, and he named 7 major oil companies that go along with him, including Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And the insanity of the people in power in this country is so outrageous. If you think of it, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia supply most first and second largest dealers, the suppliers of American oil, and Gaddafi and Libya is third. If we need the oil, then don't have war training over there. Don't try to kill the man if you're buying the oil from him. If you're self-sufficient, stay away if you don't like his policies, or try to deal or try to mediate. But when you meet him head on, he is a man who isn't afraid, and I don't believe people are going to be afraid of Ronald Reagan or Alexander Haig. And he made the statement, let's get this over with. We'll meet you with World War III, and I respect him for that position. Another article in the paper just today, in Libya's wake, who's running the United States? And there's a story about advisor Edwin Meese. They call him President Meese, and how he didn't wake up the president during the confrontation of the airplanes over Libya with the Libyan fighters. This article says during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt was often awakened to be told about battle developments. Harry Truman would hit the roof if he were asleep and there was a Libyan-U.S. dogfight. Lyndon Johnson would go in the war room, walk down in his pajamas to the Situation Room, and wouldn't stand for it. In the Reagan administration, Meese continues to make decisions and pronouncements, usually made by the president. Now, as I say, a few weeks ago, July 27th, I still have the headlines here, CIA plan to kill Gaddafi. Casey of the CIA faces a new grilling. Then to cover that up, on August the 7th, there is a large article in the Los Angeles Times about tensions threaten Mauritania stability. The chronology was that as soon as the story broke that we were to kill Gaddafi, and this was broken in the Newsweek article that came right on top of the planning of a espionage operation in Africa by the Washington Post. Then the Washington Post added 3 days later, oh no, it was Mauritania that we were going into, and I mentioned that on a broadcast last week or the week before. So July 28th, they changed it, and we were supposed to overthrow Mauritania. So August the 7th, the Los Angeles Times has an article updating Mauritania. Then August the 4th, Wall Street Journal has some small article about the Indian Ocean. And then this last week, the Washington Post ran a story. The target for overthrow or coup wasn't Mauritania, it was Mauritius. I was hysterical with laughter when I saw the map. Mauritius is a little island. You can look up the facts in any of your almanacs, a tiny island off the Indian Ocean, and Mauritania is over on the west side of Africa, on the Atlantic side. As soon as the story broke that the coup was supposed to take place in Mauritania, according to the Washington Post, the people over there went up the walls. That's the way they reported. They climbed the walls and said, what are you doing here? And so they retracted and said, oh no, Mauritania sounds so much like Mauritians that we made a mistake. So the Mauritians originally went up the wall, and the story switched around, and now it's Mauritius and not Mauritania. This story gets worse and worse, and of course Mr. Casey is in limbo, and he threatened to blackmail this country with more espionage secrets if he was forced to go before the House Intelligence Committee. So Barry Goldwater and the others backed down, and of course he holds a lot of trump cards. There's a big story. I'm not going into it this week, but I'll be updating it soon. It has to do with the arrest of a party, 4 people, who bombed the Harvey Resort Hotel Casino. It's an important story because the man who was named the chief character in there, Mr. Burgess, B-I-R-G-E-S, is a native of Hungary. He worked for Hitler's SS troops. He was a member of the Gestapo and Hitler's team, and then he worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. And he's asking now that he not be tried in Reno, that his life is in danger. And he said it would take only 20 or 30,000, and we 4 witnesses would be killed. Who is responsible for that? Nobody would be responsible. Nobody would talk. There would only be 4 dead people. Now, he's afraid that he'll be killed at the time of the trial if they carry it on in Reno. And he also said this week, many people have been assassinated, including bosses and witnesses, with very little trouble. And if we're transferred to Reno, we will never reach the court. I continually go on this broadcast about witnesses that are killed, people that are assassinated. So this member of Hitler's stormtroopers that worked with Adolf Hitler in Hungary and then comes to the United States and said he worked with the CIA is the person who has been arrested along with 3 other people for bombing, not only bombing the Harvey's Resort Hotel Casino in Reno, but he had a lot of ammunition and weapons for bigger operations than that. At the time of these bombings, I called these Reagan's Reichstag, that we'd have a series of bombings and terrorism so we could accumulate facts on terrorism in America, and it always goes back to bank robberies, Nazis, Gestapo, and the CIA. Another matter I'll take up in future length is that Taiwan jet disaster and the killing of the professor from Carnegie Mellon that was thrown out the window in Taiwan that's causing a scandal. This professor was interrogated by the police in Taiwan. Just this last week, 2 weeks ago, he was murdered. And just this week, yesterday, the investigation began on a large Taiwan jet disaster. There are people from the United States on that plane that were killed, and one from Vancouver, Washington. It'll be interesting to know who was on the plane. It completely disintegrated and was blown up, and the flight recorder and so forth have not been located. And I doubt if they will be able to finger exactly. If we don't have a list of passengers, we won't know the relationship to the Taiwan secret police, but the United States government is in a very hot position because they're intimidating people in the United States, like the Shah of Iran's Savak secret police did in the United States. And the Vietnamese killed a person in San Francisco who was favorable to Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese. We have a terror group in the United States of Laotians, Vietnamese, Croatians, anti-Castro Cubans, people from other countries who are killing in the United States where we're supposed to have freedom of speech, and they're killing opponents or people that expose the repression or the fascist dictatorships that we're supporting overseas. So that jet disaster comes right on top of a major scandal in the media of the death of the professor and also the involvement of the Taiwanese in the United States of killing people and threatening them here. Another item in the news that I want to go at length with in the future has to do with that Christopher Boyce, the spy, who's been on the loose for 19 months. He left Lompoc prison. They believed that he had several aliases. They believed that he was in South Africa. I have reason to connect at length that I don't have time tonight, the Christopher Boyce story, walking out of Lompoc jail. Lompoc is where that art gallery was where 3 people were murdered recently in Santa Barbara, in Ronald Reagan's hometown, that involved diamond dealing in South Africa, a wife in London, a court reporter in Seattle who was associated with the man that's been charged with those 3 murders in Santa Barbara. Christopher Boyce was located living up in the Seattle area in Port Angeles, and because he was a jogger or a health food freak or liked a certain vitamin E, it gave the federal marshals a chance to put agents into health food stores, to jogging stores, to campsites, and it's a wonderful place to have. They had FBI waitresses and agents with fishermen, loggers, and campers. This Boyce has had quite an activity that I think also links to the Wells Fargo story, and I'll do more on that later, but he was caught up in Seattle just this week. An article in the San Francisco Chronicle by Carl Bernstein on Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, United States, and China arming Afghanistan, the rebels, to fight the Soviet Union. And there's a map of each of those countries' involvement. Well, one reason the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan when it did was that the United States and the CIA were arming all the borders of Afghanistan with intent for war against the Soviet Union by 1985, and they took the step of taking Afghanistan to secure a border other than the Soviet Union on their southern side. But this article is by Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame, who wrote The Final Days and All the President's Men, and he has maps and areas of the Egyptians training, the Saudi Arabians training, Pakistan, China, and the United States, and our involvement in trying to recapture Afghanistan for the CIA. Another article I want at length in the future, always, if we have time, to go into William Casey's background and that Max Ugel. And while Casey has been called before the House Committee on his involvement in the CIA and his financial holdings, he's been pulling a Philip Agee. Philip Agee had his passport taken away for naming names, but Casey is getting even with the investigators. So he gave various members of Congress an 11-page text to the senators on Capitol Hill, and he exposed his recent travels to Europe, Asia, Central America, Middle East, and he visited 20 station chiefs in the area. Now, Casey mentioned people in the CIA that have never been mentioned before, and he's using names, bringing them out in the open, such as Claire George, the director of the clandestine services, John Stein, the counterintelligence covert action, John McMahon, Harry Rowan, new chief of domestic collection, Joe Screw, Shurgrue, didn't pronounce it right, but that's okay, I'll give you the spelling, Jim Glarum. This is from the Houston Post, and Casey's getting mad. He's naming people publicly. It isn't in all the newspapers, but he's giving the congressman a lot of names, and he's visiting a lot of countries. Now, I use the term getting unglued very often on this program because for a long period of time since World War II, the espionage establishment has been doing a lot of mischief, illegal deeds, overthrowing countries for particular profits of corporations, killing heads of states, leaders in this country, presidents, candidates, senators, members of the CIA, FBI, witnesses to trials. There has been a lot of drug dealing, there's been a lot of murders, there's been a lot of dirty work. And the important thing is that many of the systems are unglued now. The banks are being exposed, people are coming out with massive amount of articles, good information, and the pieces of the puzzle are coming together. So Mr. Casey has been taking trips to 20 station chiefs that you don't know about, and he, I would say, is nervous as hell. And I think the whole gang that have worked since the National Security Council was formed in 1947, who were in the OSS that became the CIA, have reason to have anxiety because they don't know when a James McCord is going to come forward and tell the truth and spill more beans, such as we had at the time of Watergate, or they don't know who's going to be murdered next, like John Paisley, Sheffield Edwards, William Harvey. Many of the top agents were just slain outright, Gary Underhill, witnesses to the Kennedy assassination, and others are hiding, and they hoping, I'm sure, that no major breaks come, and they know that they're vulnerable because these past deeds are indeed coming together very nicely and pretty fast right now, and I'm not pessimistic about it. I think within maybe 2 or 3 months, I'll have a pretty good chart for you that you can get with the tape cassettes or by sending a self-addressed stamped envelope of the major characters in these roles of conspiracy. There's a new book out about H.L. Hunt and the oil money in Texas, on the Texas rich, and there's a page in there about Bill Wood giving H.L. Hunt a diagram of with his name on it of the involvement of the Kennedy assassination. Well, Bill Wood was Bill Boxley, and I gave him that. He was a double agent, and I drew that diagram when I left Carmel and went to New Orleans to see Jim Garrison when he arrested Clay Shaw for the role of killing John Kennedy. And I wanted to show Garrison the links of the Texas people to the killing of Kennedy. And I did a detailed diagram of the names involved in the Texas area, one of them being H.L. Hunt. And then Bill Boxley took that back to H.L. Hunt, and this new book mentions that diagram and chart, and that's the one that I did after my 8 years of research in the Kennedy assassination of breaking down the witness testimony and so forth. So it's interesting that the chart that I created and made was in the hands of H.L. Hunt, and that's the one that I took to Bill Boxley, who Jim Garrison charged with being a double agent, and he was working back in Texas, going from New Orleans to Texas, and working with H.L. Hunt, the oil man. There's another book out. I haven't read it. It's a book review, and I want to call attention to it now and give you more of this later on the air, because this sounds very exciting. The book review is in the Village Voice, August the 11th, August 12th to 18th. For those of you that have these tape cassettes and broadcasts in New York and can still get it, August the 12th to 18th, Village Voice. It's a book review by Charles Mann. He wrote the review. The book is called The Declassified Eisenhower. Blanche, Weiss, and Cook wrote it. It's a double-day book. And it's a three-page review of very, very important information, but there is one sentence in here I'd like to share with you, and then we'll get back to more of it later. Cook, according to this book reviewer, sees the Soviet Revolution as the actual beginning of the Cold War. There is no way to make sense of appeasement. The twisted course of World War II, or the second phase of the world, what we call the Cold War, which started in 1945 when World War II was over, without understanding how it all began in 1917. Lenin belligerently removed almost 9 million square miles of the Earth's surface from the reach of Western entrepreneurs, and they were terrified that this action could be repeated in other nations, and if that occurred, the United States would lose out its grab on corporations and so forth. And that is the bottom line of the insanity that we read in the news today. Everything that we're doing to pollute the earth, to take away from the people, the poor people, to conscript them into the army or put them to prison, to eliminate their good health standards, their hospitalization, to reduce them to slavery is what Adolf Hitler did. The American corporations did this in Germany, and they're doing it in the United States because their only goal is the war against the Soviet Union. And whatever it takes, if they have to increase the budget for the weapons and give you nothing, they'll give you nothing. They won't give you education. They're not going to provide housing. They're not going to provide health care. And those other three things that I've talked about on the air for the past 10 years. There are a group of insane people who simply cannot live with an economic system where people have control of the resources, and the benefit of the resources goes to the people or the factories, that they own a share of it. They may all have less, but they all have something, and they're not walking around with organized crime and mafia and hitmen and drugging the major cities, and the recreation is less complex. They don't have television in every room or car in every home, but they have rapid transit and they have transportation and health care and so forth equal to ours. And the insanity that went on after the Russian Revolution created the funding of Adolf Hitler, the negation of the Versailles Treaty, and then it went on to making a war in Europe, and when we couldn't win Russia, we began to arm again. Now, this book review tells about Eisenhower coming home from the war and becoming the president of Columbia University, and then the corporations taking him under their wing and transferring him around to the various meetings of the corporations and the corporation heads like General Electric and so forth. And it goes into the legacy Eisenhower gave us of course, meeting with John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles and taking over Southeast Asia in 1954 when the French were to leave, or the Bay of Pigs operation they planned before Kennedy was president, and the overthrow in Guatemala of the president there for United Fruit Company, and going to bed with the Nazis like Darlan in French North Africa and the Vichy anti-Semites, the people that worked with Adolf Hitler at the time. And it goes into Eisenhower's role in Southeast Asia, North Africa, in Iran with Mossadegh overthrown, and gives him the credit for not being the simple-minded, homespun little Ike that he was supposed to be. This book was based on 10 years of documents, the declassified Eisenhower, and I'll do a lot more on it. One interesting item in the book review tells how when the corporations begin to wine and dine him, they take him out to California to the Bohemian Grove. I also have another article I brought in, if I get time to get at the bottom of piles of material I bring in each week, about Alexander Haig's career and how he launched it at the Bohemian Grove to be president of the United States someday. That is that little grove in California where every summer the real wheeler and dealers, the war machines, the moguls, the people who profit from war, the institutions and organizations that make the war, whether it's John McCone from ITT or the Bechtel Corporation or Corning Glass and U.S. Steel and Hewlett-Packard, you name it. The real biggies that decide which countries exist, which heads of states live or die, that's where they dress up like girlies and wear their skirts and tutus and dance in their little colleges and burn all their cares away. And it's an all-male gang who can do whatever their thing is. And their last meeting was terrifying, some of the things that came up just this last summer, or enough the discussion to make your hair stand on end. But Haig's decision to make him the president was launched out there. The decision for Eisenhower to be catapulted from Columbia University, where they encouraged him to read a book there. The articles, the book reviews suggest he hardly read a book at Columbia, but he was too busy with his mistress. They fixed him up in Europe and at home, and the trick is to get them a woman, keep them happy, introduce them to the head of the corporations, make the decisions for them. But also this book says he was plenty mean, like Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan. These guys look like simpletons, but it'd be hard to create what is in their gray matter or their brains. I think they were probably conniving little bastards from the time they were little, squealing on their brothers and goodness knows what else. You couldn't make them that bad when they get in a position of power. They must have been psyched out years ago by the crummiest people around and put in to lead this country. And the nice people can't visualize how bad they are until they get in the vice. And they go around thinking, well, if there's headless El Salvadorians, they must be communists. They just simply cannot believe how mean Alexander Haig or Caspar Weinberger or Ronald Reagan or Edwin Meese and their mentality are. If you're nice, it's hard to visualize those people, so you have to blame the victim for his own mishap. You think, well, he stepped out of line because these people can't be that bad. It's important to take another look at the newspaper, the history, the books, and realize they're not only bad, but they're rotten. Now I'm going to go to a different subject that's close to my heart before we reach the end of this first half hour. The Continuing Inquiry is a newsletter Ben Jones gets out from Texas. Many of you subscribe to it. Some of you don't have it. And this last issue that came out, it was a little late. It was June 1981. There are many good articles I will share with you on the air, but there's one by Marvin Longton. I don't know him at all. He's a researcher from Rhode Island, Penn said. He's going to get me his address. It's called The Nugan Bank, John Paisley, Lee Harvey Oswald link with a question mark. For those of you who don't know the name, Frank Nugan is a member of the CIA who was murdered. Michael Hand is alive. He's a member of heroin traffic, CIA assassination teams. They were partners that formed a bank that folded quickly. $55 million is still floating around. It's in Australia. The bank folded in Australia. John Paisley was a man from the National Security Council that worked with the Soviet Union counterintelligence, who I said worked with Lee Harvey Oswald's communication master. That was Yuri Nosenko, who came from the Soviet Union to the United States right after Oswald came to this country. He fled to this country. Now, I've talked many times on this program about that bank and the links to the assassination teams in Chile, Operation Condor, that Jack Anderson writes about, and to the people that have been killing the heads of states, whether it was to overthrow Iran, Guatemala, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, shooting George Wallace, and hundreds of other murders. There is a link here, and I was the first person in the country of any researcher to make these connections. And in this article, he goes on about the Nugan Bank and their funding, and he then goes back. He says it's interesting to go a little further. Keep in mind Mae Brussell's previous piece on Lee Harvey Oswald in the Soviet Union. I wrote that for Penn in February 22nd, 1979, called Yuri Nosenko, The Missing Link, a very important short article I did for Penn Jones' newsletter, and he refers to it twice in the link of Lee Harvey Oswald, because that is the connection of Lee Harvey Oswald to Navy intelligence, to the National Security Council. Very important connections, and this is the first article giving me credit for making the links and for seeing those connections himself. We'll take a break for 1 minute and then go back to some other important stories in the news. Okay, now many of those items I mentioned I will do more in depth as time goes on, but I want you to know that they're out there if you want to get a hold of the copies of those articles and be reading them in the meantime. Last week I sort of did a litany of maybe 20 of the most obnoxious stories of the week and the most disgusting news items. And again, keep in mind that the common denominator between the news stories I run off and the final conclusion is that intense paranoia described in this new book on Eisenhower that I've said many times is that this country is geared to do anything it has to do to get that war ready for 1985. Now, the goal is against Russia in 1985, but if Gaddafi knows it and he's being a pawn and we're planning to kill him, he says, bring it on, I'll meet you eyeball to eyeball. So maybe it would be tomorrow because he has Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and 5 other oil countries behind him. And it would be very hard to make war against Russia in 1985 without oil for airplane, ground troops, and all the necessities that the industrialized nations depend upon. And we're not sure our allies will go for it. But that is the insanity goal, and all the other decisions we make that are bankrupting us are because of this goal of not trying to coexist. On the printed sheet last week with the tape that went out, I mentioned subjects such as the decision of the neutron bomb, the bubonic rats near Reagan's ranch, another article in the paper, Horrors in Istanbul, and it's about a young woman who was drugged. 2 men followed her, and 1 man in front and 1 in back, and one injected her leg with a needle, and she became unconscious, and they put a tranquilizing drug, and luckily she ran to somebody who saved her and protected her, and they're taking young women and then selling them into slavery. There are over 50,000 missing young people in the United States today, but the important thing about this story, Horrors in Istanbul, was that she described a similar event on 99 Golden Gate Avenue in San Francisco, where a 21-year-old woman was abducted, injected with drugs, forced into prostitution, and escaped. This is happening to people in Europe who never get back home in the United States, and it's happening in the United States. And one of the big problems is, in addition to atomic weapons, is the drug weapons, the mind control techniques, and the physical weapons to grab and take whatever these people want. Another news article last week, 750 million living in absolute poverty. Another one, $500 million to be outlaid for a special defense program. The United States will put up over $1 trillion in weapons in the next few years, but we need another $500 million, according to the Washington Post, to go quickly into wartime production to build extra plant capacity, extra workers to work emergency around the clock. It's not enough to have an increase this year of 7% after last year, a total of $222 billion for weapons, but Casper Weinberger is asking for $500 million for another speed-up program on the side. Another article in the San Jose Mercury last week that was on the sheets, the bibliography, mergers consolidate control of silver mining industry. There's a absolute control trying to take over all the silver and mining in a group of corporations. There's a large group, a silver war going on in the United States up in Idaho, and it's getting very nasty. But overseas and in the United States, there is a determination to control all of the silver market by a few people, just as they are controlling all the gold and copper by a handful of corporations. Another article by Worldwide Abuse of Antibiotics. Druggists and doctors have a global threat. They prescribe drugs that are not needed in America and Europe, and people can't even build up a resistance. The antibiotics won't even work. They're doling them out without prescriptions. A new book out, The King Over the Waters, The Scandalous Truth About the Windsors. This is Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, 1495. This is how they left Nassau in utter disgrace. This is Edward VIII, who married the great Wallace Simpson of Baltimore. It tells about the Windsors being too close to treason, to riot and murder. An interesting story on the ruling class in London. Besides riding around in glass coaches, they get into some messy trouble, and Sir Harry Oakes was the fellow that was murdered down there in the Bahamas, that they were associated with that scandal. I mentioned briefly last week a very serious problem I didn't go into, the 1 billion line of credit, the corporate cloud, and how certain corporations like U.S. Steel can get 3 billion credit if it wants to expand. Other corporations can get huge amounts of credit. Small people would have to go out of business because they can't borrow to maintain a mom and pop store or even 1 or 2 or 3 stores. But Mobil and Gulf Corporation can expand their business with $6 billion each. They got credit. They can buy hotels, chemical companies, coal, solar energy. Texaco got $5.5 billion credit, Marathon Oil $5 billion, and DuPont Services $4 billion. There's a long list of corporations that just say, I want this credit, and they get it, and then they can buy up and crowd out any other businesses that come along. A very sad story in the United States, not in El Salvador, was in Newsweek. This was in July 20th. It was almost a month ago. It was a month ago, but it really disturbed me. The title of it is called Death on Juneteenth. June 19th is celebrated in Texas because when the Emancipation Proclamation came in the United States in 1865, the blacks in Texas weren't told about it for 2 years. They kept them slaves for 2 years longer, and being responsible for the news media and the communication, they didn't find it convenient to tell them they were freed. So when they were finally freed on this June 19th, they began celebrations. And this year, the law enforcement picked up 3 black youths, 2 of them very good swimmers, put handcuffs on them, and threw them into a river where they drowned. It was 8 or 10 feet of water, and the youths were excellent swimmers and were drowned. And I'm sure that the law enforcement people really got a kick out of that. The reason they picked them up was they were at the celebration. They saw one of the teenagers had marijuana possession. It's absolutely ludicrous when you read the headlines and stories about the heroin and the cocaine dealing $1 to $10 million out of Houston, Texas, Fort Worth, Texas, Dallas, and shipping it to islands in the Bahamas and Colombian narcotics coming in airplanes, huge millions of dollars of narcotics. So the police go after a kid with a joint. They handcuffed the 3 of them, 2 excellent swimmers, and drowned them, handcuffed in 8 to 10 feet of water. 3 of the men, the law enforcement people this week, a month later, were charged on a misdemeanor for the men drowning, or the boys. The charge was negligent homicide for allegedly violating the Texas Water Safety Act. Another important book out, and I'm mentioning several books here, there's a book on the churches and the funding of the political people under the title of church leaders. It's called Primetime Preachers by Jeffrey Haddon and Charles Swan. It's a new book, Addison Wesley Publishing Company. Now this goes into Billy Graham and his association, how in 1977 it turned out he had $23 million in Texas in addition to his Minneapolis headquarters. Oral Roberts with his millions and millions, $50 million a year sent to him from television, Rex Humbard, Jerry Falwell, Robert Schuller, Pat Robertson, and the various organizations. Robertson is a graduate of Yale University, a Marine captain in Korea, host of the 700 Club. When I came to KLRB this evening, KGO had a program I was listening to, a new article that came out called Gold in the Church. I didn't even get to hear the title of the article, who wrote it, but I'll check it up later. And the moderator was talking about the fact that these churches are tax deductible, and the money coming into them is, each one of these people gets $20 million, $21 million, $40 million. And when the churches were separated, separation of church and state, there were ma and pa churches next to ma and pa red schoolhouses, and there were tax deductions for running these little churches. And the separation of church and state was never meant for this, because people like Richard Mellon Skate and the Coors Beer people and H.L. Hunt alone, this woman was mentioning, gave like $15 or $12 million to the church. Now, they're not just using it for religion. They're not using it to feed the poor. There's no daycare centers for children. There's no extra money if security checks run out, or for crippled or blind or deaf, or any social benefits. They're putting it in to destroying members of Congress who are in favor of abortions, who are against the war in El Salvador, who don't like the planned troop movement and provoking of people like Gaddafi, if we're buying from them, irritating them, the assassination plans of foreign leaders. Any politician who opposes the terrible policies of this administration or past administrations is targeted. We got rid of even conservative liberals. A whole bunch of them got out in the last election. So the money is going to the church, because then they don't have to tell who gave the money, and the church is giving it to politicians, and this is all secret money. So we're talking about billions of dollars. Over $1 million a week is raised just from using television. And this new article, I'll have to get it, or maybe she was quoting from this book. I have to check it out. It's called Primetime Preachers. Tells about their owning cable television, cable stations, radio stations, TV. And again, they're down in the South this weekend, burning rock music, burning Elvis Presley, telling Satan sent them, and deciding what books are in libraries, what music you can hear. They train people at various bases, people like Mark David Chapman that killed John Lennon at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, or at a CIA training camp in Beirut, Lebanon, where he was, or in DeKalb County in Georgia, heavily linked to the assassinations. The church is not separate from the politics, and this is one of the major problems in the country today, is pinning this down and separating it drastically. Now, it would take a surgical incision to simply cut it off, and I'm speaking about probably impossibilities because most people can't visualize the role of the church in political assassinations. I guess my first awareness came when I was reading the Warren Commission hearings and came to the volume sections about Albert Osborne. He was a missionary from Tennessee. He was on the bus going to Mexico with Lee Harvey Oswald. He worked for the National Security Council. He was over in Jamaica, where John Connally and various people involved in these assassinations, again, heavily funding churches. John Connally is into that movement. He's at Tyrol Bay with the large espionage operations. This Osborne was in London. He had dual citizenship between the United States and London, similar to the way Herbert Hoover had. And he accompanied Oswald to Mexico while Oswald was working for Navy intelligence, and he ran a school in Oaxaca, Mexico, that was blown, the cover was blown over in 1970 by David Copeland, using the name Torbett as his alias, the Torbett document. And the churches in the Warren Commission hearings, the published volumes, had names of churches and organizations in Texas, Tennessee, California that would send money to Mexico. And this was a missionary in Mexico, and he also used the name of Bowen. Osborne had a double name of Bowen, and Jack Howard Bowen, and this money was going down to Mexico, and then it went to train assassins run by Division 5 of the FBI by J. Edgar Hoover and William Sullivan of the FBI. And maybe sometime in the future we'll go more detail into that hearing. Those hearings. Now, did the people from these little churches who were sending $25 and $50 from all over the Southwest know it was going to a school for assassins, sending merchandise down there, or did they just think they were helping the church? They could have been a mom and pop operation that they didn't know about, but Bowen and Osborne got passports and traveled all over the world, and that was my first awareness of the churches. Now, we're talking about small amount of money to run this missionary of assassins that then linked down to Operation Condor, down to Chile, and the larger operation of Nazis all over the world, and the major assassination teams that work throughout every country in the world. Now, when you get an operation of people like H.L. Hunt and these large corporations pouring millions of dollars into what you call churches and raking in 10, 20, 30 million a year, it's very serious when a man like Randolph Hearst creates Billy Graham and says, let's puff him up and plump him up, and Henry Luce, who owned Lifetime and Fortune, the great Cold Warrior, written extensively in this new book about Allen Dulles, the role of Henry Luce, when he says, let's send Billy Graham to Europe and begin a Christian crusade, and then put millions of dollars in his hands, so much that a bank in Minneapolis can't even account. He forgets he has $23 million in Texas. He's embarrassed, according to this book on Primetime Preachers, that he had $23 million he didn't remember in Texas. So the separation of the church and the assassination teams is very, very important. There's another article by George Wilson in the Washington Post about the problem with our Navy being on mothballs, and the Navy can't run because we're building submarines and nobody to man them. The men aren't experienced enough. They can't get duty on the sea. We're spending billions of dollars, and the article tells how the ships really can't be run because there's nobody intelligent enough to take the ships out long enough to achieve the goal. The Navy's goal was to make the men work these machines, and they're so complicated they can't even work them. It's a long article from the Washington Post on the problem, the build-up Navy, and how they have to be on the shore because the ships are too complicated to be run by the people who are going into the schools to learn how to run them. At the time that I believe was Alexander Haig was speaking, or Ronald Reagan, at the graduation at Annapolis this year, was the day that one of the airships working for the Navy went right into the deck of the atomic submarine. Later, the autopsy showed that the guys had drugs in their stomachs. I wonder, even without drugs, if they knew what they were doing. But the ships and the machinery that we're making that is so complicated that we could build schools and hospitals and have enrichment programs for students and bare necessities are going into dinosaurs of machinery that can't even be run. And when they run into trouble. They're built inefficiently, or they're too big when they're launched to even sail out. They have to dig out a special place for them. The people that make the errors and the cost overruns get new contracts, and the inefficiency and the waste is the tragedy. There is so much to do with the money. We can't have the war anyway, and these crazy people are insisting on putting over $1 trillion into weapons, billions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into pieces of machinery that these drugged idiots won't be able to use, instead of making this a beautiful country with low-cost energy and solar energy and stop the pollution. It's a dual tragedy because the technology is here to make the changes, but the people are too lazy. They have too many diversions, too many pleasures. There's just too much going to be bothered, and it can't be for ignorance, because certainly what I'm sharing with you on the air is information that is available, and many people can see what's coming down and others can't. But the process is, how do you get a paper and read selectively what you want to see and not take in what you don't want to see? The fine line of switching sometimes, say, from an AM to an FM station. I'm in Carmel and I'll be shopping, and somebody will see me and say, oh, I'd love to hear you. I hear you whenever you're on KGO, they'll mention. I said, well, I'm on every Sunday night on KLRB. And I bring this up over and over because there's the AM mentality and the FM mentality, and those people simply cannot switch a dial. They like what you say. They're afraid of the way the country is going, but they're too lazy to take a knob and turn it 1/8 of an inch to find out something else besides what the major media is giving to them. And they don't take all the papers that I have here, and they can't assimilate that much information on their own, but they just simply can't turn the dial. The Washington Post had an article August the 4th, a camp for high-powered Bohemians. That's the story of Monte Rio. It's in Santa Rosa, California. And this article tells about the summer of the Bohemian Club. Mollenhoff has written a book, Clark Mollenhoff, it's called The Bohemian Grove. And Domhoff, pardon me, it isn't Mollenhoff, it's Domhoff who wrote The Bohemian Grove. And in this article it says, in the early 40s, a few fellows were pushing twigs around the campfire. Here they decided to build an atomic bomb, they say. And right here in 1979, Alexander Haig Jr. launched his bid for the presidency. This year, Caspar Weinberger talked July 17th on rearming America. There was another talk by Caltech President Marvin Goldberger on space wars. John Young and Frank Crippen talked about their space shuttle, and people that attended the meeting were described as Mr. Bechtel Sr., S.D. Bechtel Sr. and Jr. from Hillsborough, businessman, Charles Black, Shirley Temple's husband, Leonard Firestone, Peter Flanagan, former Nixon aide, Gerald Ford, Pan Am chief Najib Halabi, whose daughter is married to King Hussein of Jordan, metal tycoon Edgar Kaiser Jr., Secretary of State former Henry Kissinger, former CIA Director John A. McCone, who also was head of the ITT and instrumental in the CIA. He was the director when Kennedy was assassinated. And the names go on: George P. Shultz from Bechtel Corporation, Attorney General William French Smith, George Ball, and so forth. When the subject came up about atomic waste, one of the members said, "Atomic waste is no problem." A scientist said, "We will soon be rocketing the stuff into the sun." If you don't think they're idiots, just let me know. I think they're absolutely obscene. And of course, it was Eisenhower that was taken there to do his little dance in the forest with these people. They burn the symbolism of no care, and they have a good time. They have a lot of little rituals you can read in the book, The Bohemian Grove. George Ball, this article says, was dressed up in a red hooded robe and a torch. A torch is a coffin that is symbolizing dull care. And then the orchestra plays a funeral dirge, and the program goes on, and they pour kerosene all over this coffin, dull cares. And you can see George Ball, a former diplomat, dressed up as Squeaky Fromm, dancing around the forest. And there's more than that goes on, but that's the way the leaders of the world, the so-called free world, occupy themselves. Another article in the Washington Post about dengue fever. It's in the Caribbean. Fidel Castro has been calling it the Yankee CIA problem. That they had the ability to eradicate dengue fever. They held it up, the Pan American Health Organization. Finally, when Castro said the CIA is sending this down to Cuba and that there's 200,000 cases of it, and blamed the United States for causing the death of at least 113 people in Cuba, hemorrhaging and terrible shock syndrome, the United States finally came forward and sent something over there to take care of this condition. There have been means to curtail this, and the United States has kept them off, and it's been a terrible thing in the Caribbean. But this is one of those little items. We have vials of germs, germ warfare down in the Germ Control Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And just as the churches should be dismantled from their deductions, any church that has a budget of over $100,000 a year should have everything accountable of who puts the money in and where it's spent. And anything less than $100,000, let them play around with it. But this is a terrible problem. The people that have this immense wealth and are killing political careers of fine people by pouring money from the church to Richard Vogary and the far right to get their opinions put into Congress. And it's a tragedy. If we lose the Congress totally, and we've practically lost it, it's because these things are happening. Men like Howard Hughes' organization, and if Hughes wasn't alive, said, "I want to select the district attorneys, the police chiefs, the attorney generals, the justices of the Supreme Court, the vice presidents, and the presidents and the members of Congress." And of course, we got view of the Correa Gate, the payoff of members of Congress, and their Bobby Baker's mistresses and call houses to control Congress. The system is falling apart at every level. The germ warfare is one example. The churches is another. Another interesting article in the Washington Post, for those of you interested in minerals and diamonds, South Africa is buying from the Soviet Union, trying to buy up the diamond market of the world. This article says South Africa and Soviet Union, an odd pair on the mineral market. The Soviet Union is diamond rich, and they're selling their diamonds, and then of course they can buy their space programs or their neutron weapons. And Johannesburg, South Africa wants to control the entire diamond market of the world. So they're taking the money from the Soviet Union. The South African Reserve Bank last year sold more than $10 billion worth of gold, and the Soviets' Zurich-based bank dealt with the same bullion dealers and Swiss banks and the Anglo-American Bank, and they're putting it in London-based consolidated gold fields, gold mining deals, and the Soviet Union is selling diamonds to South Africa, and South Africa is putting them in London and also using them to buy up the gold market, the De Beers Consolidated Mines, Harry Oppenheimer's Anglo-American corporations. This is from the Washington Post, August the 4th, 1981. It has to do with commodities such as gold, asbestos, iron, manganese, platinum. But mainly the article has to do with the relationship of South Africa to the Soviet Union. Now we think of South Africa as being very fascist, Nazi, the broader band, close links to Germany and to Argentina. But they also trade, just as Germany and Western Europe do, and Japan with the Soviet Union. They trade with the Soviet Union, and there is an exchange going back and forth. Another article out about El Salvador in the Washington Post, an account of the guerrillas and a raid by the guerrillas, and this says that this story is skeptical of the raid and the reports. The public will not believe what is being told here. The military version contains so many anomalies that Salvadorans have come to believe that the army stages attacks, such as on La Union, to portray the guerrilla enemies as foreign-backed and very strong. On that basis, the ruling junta has appealed to the United States for increased military aid, which Ambassador Dean Hinton said would be forthcoming. This is from the Boston Globe and the Washington Post, saying that the military in El Salvador are outright liars, and they're staging and blowing up areas that they say that the guerrillas in El Salvador are doing, and then they have found that these guerrilla raids were not true, and that they were shot up and done by the same pattern we had in Vietnam at the Gulf of Tonkin, an excuse for our being there, that the Salvadorans are causing raids that were not done by the guerrillas so that they could prove to America that Russia and other countries are giving the Salvadoran rebels so many weapons and they're so vicious. And then they yelled to the United States, save us, you've got to save us from these people. They're overthrowing the country. And the truth is that they staged the raids themselves, and the Washington Post and the Boston Globe have an article on the skepticism. Salvadorians themselves are skeptical of the report on the raids. There are more articles about the climate bombs coming out recently, the dire portent for the future. This is the LA Times, that green belt, that greenhouse effect. Now, they're warning about the burning of fossil fuels and coal causing discharges of carbon dioxide in the air. This greenhouse effect is the excuse, the primary excuse for building colonies in space that the book Alternative 3 describes as future slave labor camps. But they talk in these reports now every few days about this greenhouse effect and the air contamination, and yet Conoco and DuPont are going to go heavily into coals instead of alternative energy. Instead of solving the problem, if the problem exists, they create the future problem as an excuse for the next state, because the next state is to get space war in space. Jack Anderson's been writing about those plans and space colonies. So we'll go ahead with the coal, even though it causes the effect, because the effect will be the excuse for the space colony. So every few days you'll see articles, if you haven't seen them already, on the greenhouse effect. There are many good news articles out. That is all that I can share with you this week. If you read the papers closely, I think you'll see, and I know some of you are seeing what I'm seeing. The solution to it, I really don't know. It seems so far out of hand. There must be some answer to this madness, but I think before you look for solutions, you have to recognize the problem. And truthfully, I don't think enough people realize that there are problems going on. They complain about random transportation and a few minor problems, but they don't really feel or hurt enough to know the real problems. And when they feel it, then they'll move. And until they feel it, they're not going to move. So in the meantime, we just see how it moves, how the earth moves, and how they shake us around, and stay well until next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.